Good morning, and welcome to another edition of 15 Minutes of Flame. This is Robert Phoenix, broadcasting to you live from Texas. A little bit outside of Austin today, a few miles outside of Austin. It is an undisclosed location, but broadcasting nonetheless. How is everybody? We are the day after the Super Bowl, which apparently has, I think, one of the highest degrees of people not showing up for work than any other day out of the year. They should probably just make it some sort of a secular holiday. I've heard that there's been this clamor or this desire to play the Super Bowl on Saturday instead of Sunday, so that people could actually have an extra day to recuperate. I don't really have a problem with that. But big win yesterday for the Philadelphia Eagles. I watched the entire game, and the first half went by incredibly quickly. It was a very unusual game on a number of different levels, and we're going to do our best to talk about a lot of them, or as many of those levels as possible, over the course of the next half hour or so. I mean, there's a lot more going on in the world than just the Super Bowl, but the Super Bowl is always an interesting cipher for our times. And this is the first, I would say, true Super Bowl under the Trump administration. And of course, under Obama, we had 8 of them. And the Super Bowls under Obama were very strange. There was a high degree of covert and overt symbolism that was Luciferic. I mean, blatantly Luciferic. I mean, I think the peak and the pinnacle was the Madonna Super Bowl, where she was performing with MIA and the little tiny rapper whose name I can't even remember anymore. She's that insignificant. But that was a fascinating Super Bowl to watch from an esoteric perspective. And it was all this run up for ISIS. And you could just see what was happening with this. It was almost like there was this supernatural charging of ISIS taking place. And people were thinking about, well, ISIS from a Luciferic or an occult symbolic perspective. I mean, I actually saw this as a generative force that was charging the army of ISIS, which was the proxy army created by the U.S. and Israel, Turkey, the U.K., Saudi Arabia, and it was very occult. It was almost like a Lord of the Rings kind of deal, where they were using magic, the darker shades of magic, to transform, or actually not even transform, but to charge and empower this force that would ultimately become part of this global jihad, which it has not, and it has failed. Maybe it was meant to fail. Who knows? But it was an interesting time, and there's a lot of other stuff that was happening that was very ISIS-like during that period. I covered a lot of that on my website years ago, and seemed to be pretty on time in a lot of ways. And there are many other examples of the symbolism for the Super Bowls that, again, was quite blatant. The Super Bowl down in New Orleans, where we had brother versus brother. You remember that one? The Harbaughs down in New Orleans, and Beyonce's halftime Super Bowl performance, which was very electric, to say the least. And there were very clear images that were being strobed into that stage. Again, I broke that down on my website. And then even last year, which was theoretically the first year of Trump, so it would be technically the first Trump Super Bowl, but all the planning went into that Super Bowl prior to Trump. And we had the, Coldplay and Beyonce again. Is that right? Let me see now. Let me just go back in time. Last year, no. I'm wrong with that. I think that last year was Katy Perry. Katy Perry or Lady Gaga. Okay, it was two Super Bowls ago where we had Coldplay and we had Beyonce and Bruno Mars. That was pretty significant because, of course, they were charging. This is what the Super Bowls were doing. They were charging the the social event or the social structure that would emerge out of those Super Bowls. Clearly, that was what was going on. And when we saw with Beyonce, we saw the Black Lives Matter kind of supercharging moment. X, Coldplay. There was an incredible kind of transgender infusion that was going on through the Coldplay performance, and a lot of Mars. There was a lot of Mars. There were a lot of Mars pieces. Bruno Mars, Chris Martin. There was the symbol for Tyr, which is the rune of war and the rune of Mars. That was part of the dance troupe that Beyonce had put together. Well, the 6 foot Amazons. Anyway, I mean, so we could go back and back and back, and we could look at the ritual sacrifices before the Super Bowls, the Philip Seymour Hoffmans, the Robin Williams, Whitney Houston's daughter. You know, all three of them lost their lives just prior to a Super Bowl. So not only do we have these Super Bowl rituals, but we also have what, for all intents and purposes, in many cases, look like Illuminati sacrifices. And I also believe during the Super Bowl where Whitney Houston's daughter died, the matriarch of the Mara family also died just before the Super Bowl. Now, I'm not sure that was planned or not, but it was an interesting sort of combination between the two. Now, let's see. It was the Patriots' win against the Seahawks, and I talked about this game on my website. And by the way, I had a post up on my website yesterday, and I went through a lot of stuff. I wrote about how the games were rigged in many instances. And by the way, I didn't see any rigging in yesterday's game. I mean, unless of course you count the two semi-controversial calls where the Eagles actually were awarded touchdowns when I believe they were actual touchdowns. I don't think there was any doubt in my mind that they were touchdowns. You could look to that as being, the two controversial calls swung the game by 14 points. And I've seen calls get reversed, but it looked like, for all intents and purposes, those were clean calls. But the game itself was played fairly clean. There weren't a ton of penalties. There was one penalty that bailed the Patriots out just a little bit right before halftime. And, of course, they wound up scoring on that play or after that play on that penalty. And Tom Brady had a monster game, absolutely monster game. He was everything you would think Tom Brady to be, and yet he lost. But let's go back to the last time that the New England Patriots, what was the time the New England Patriots played the Seattle Seahawks? I believe it was the 2014 Super Bowl. So we're talking 4 years ago. And the hero of that Super Bowl was a guy by the name of Malcolm Butler. And Malcolm Butler came out of nowhere, literally and figuratively, to intercept a goal line pass. And I talked a little bit about this on the website. So he became a hero. Well, in some ways, Malcolm Butler was yesterday's GOAT. And it wasn't for anything he did on the field because Malcolm Butler did not play. Malcolm Butler had become a pretty integral part of the Patriots defense. He plays cornerback, which means he covers a player, covers a wide receiver. And this is kind of the big story in the aftermath of the game, that Malcolm Butler did not play. What's interesting about Butler from an astrological perspective is he happens to be a Pisces. And so he's run the Pisces gamut, right? From the hero, maybe not to the GOAT, but certainly to the sacrificial aspect of this Super Bowl might have been Malcolm Butler because he did not play. And you just go on the internet, do a little search. Why was Malcolm Butler benched? Where the hell was Malcolm Butler? So apparently the Butler did it or didn't. The interesting thing about Butler is his number is the inverse of Tom Brady's. Tom Brady is 12 and Malcolm Butler is 21. And so we have this mirror effect between the hero and the GOAT, or the sacrificial aspect, or the player who is sacrificed for the good of the team. For whatever reason, Bill Belichick happens to be a very uh, hardcore coach. He's old school. Bill Belichick is old school. I mean, he comes out of that Vince Lombardi, Bill Parcells, Bobby Knight. He loves the military. You play for the Patriots, you're playing for a military style coach. He's an Aries. Of course, he's going to be, filled with sort of this military zeal. And what was interesting is that there were two plays yesterday that were critical plays in the game, and they had to do with the kicking team. And the long snapper for the Patriots is a guy by the name of Joe Cardona, who played college football at Navy. So the Navy imprint, and Belichick loves the Navy. Loves the Navy. And which branch of our military probably has the deepest connection to intelligence and intelligence gathering? It's the Navy. So Bill Belichick has some of that in him. Of course, he's been often considered as a cheat, where he would send people into the other team's practices. He does this routinely, by the way. And he does this for every team in the NFL, because he knows that at some point he's going to play those teams and he wants as much intel on them as possible. And they actually got caught for doing this. They were caught videotaping the walkthrough of the St. Louis Rams when they played them in the Super Bowl, which was Tom Brady's first Super Bowl just after 9/11. It was the first Super Bowl after 9/11. And they had brought Whitney Houston out again, speaking of Whitney Houston, to sing the national anthem, because she had done such a fantastic job selling patriotism when there was Gulf War I. Now we're about ready to go into Gulf War II, so we needed another dose of Whitney Houston. But Houston, we have a problem, because ultimately Whitney herself succumbed to the same type of sacrificial dark magic that seems to have infused the Super Bowl. Now, I don't believe it did not happen for Whitney before a Super Bowl. In fact, it happened on the heels of the Grammys. That was a big deal. People remember that, but sacrifice nonetheless. Interesting. Malcolm Butler, number 21, Tom Brady, number 12. So we have the mirror reflection of 21 and 12, the hero and the GOAT, even though Tom Brady was called the GOAT prior to the game, GOAT meaning the greatest of all time. So I talked about some of this stuff on my website, and I did that post yesterday, 2,222 words. I wasn't even planning on it, 22. It worked out okay. At least I thought it did. And there's a lot of other stuff I talked about in the post, and ultimately I got into this symbolism around this Super Bowl, which was Super Bowl LI. But if you look at the symbol, I did not post the actual symbol in my piece on my website, but if you look at the symbol, it's the L, and then there's the Lombardi Trophy, which is a column, and there's a football that's set at an angle. It almost looks like an eye with a dot on top, and the football being the dot. So we have I, which is 999, I being the ninth letter in the alphabet. And if you flip that over, it's 666. So there is some symbolism in this game that they're supercharging to some degree something. But what was really interesting about this game, and I'm going to get into the bones of it a bit more here, was the halftime show. And normally we've been conditioned, literally, to see these halftime shows and then begin to deconstruct them based on who was there and what was being played and the symbols that are connected to the actual performance of the show. I mean, we talked about this ad infinitum. So this Super Bowl halftime performance was Justin Timberlake. I thought, well, this is an interesting choice. Why Justin Timberlake? Well, of course, there's the Disney background and whatever went on there down in Disney World with Timberlake and Christina Aguilera and Britney Spears and all the other Masketeers. So I just, that we put that aside, put that on the shelf for a little bit. And then Timberlake is an Aquarian, and there was a very strong Aquarian theme in this Super Bowl. Number one, the Super Bowl itself took place on an Aquarian day. And the Super Bowl used to take place in January before the 21st and 22nd day of January, which would make it a Capricornian event. But I believe it was Super Bowl 15 where they first started to have it in the month of Aquarius. And ever since then, that was 1985. 1985, right? I believe so, yes. And after that, we've been dealing with Aquarian Super Bowls ever since. I have to check on that. Put an asterisk by that. But it was Super Bowl 15. It was the Raiders versus the Eagles. And I think I was 23, so it might have been 1983. Let's go with 1983. The first Aquarian Super Bowl. Well, continuing with the Aquarian theme, Nick Foles is born on the 0 degree of Aquarius, which makes him uber Aquarian. Even though when you look at Nick Foles, you would not say that this is a rebellious guy. He's not radical. He's not revolutionary. There are some things about him that are interesting. I read a piece on him where when he was in high school, and he played ball just up the road from my house here in Austin. He played ball at Westlake High School, which is if you live in Westlake, you've got some money. You got some cabbage. And apparently Nick Foles' dad was a very successful restaurateur. He's an entrepreneurial type A guy, went for it. And was kind of he was kind of a helicopter dad with Nick and Nick's football career at Westlake. And what happened during Nick Foles' senior season is one of the guys who was on the team. Now, Nick Foles is 6'5", and this guy was also 6'5", 6'6", weighed about 300 pounds, was an offensive lineman, just an amazing physical specimen, could outrun just about anybody on the team. I think it might have been the third game of the season, and he had cardiac arrest. So here he is. He's a high school player having a heart attack during a football game. And they rushed onto the field. Apparently this guy's father and mother were both doctors. They had the paramedics. They were there, and they saved his life. But apparently this event really impacted the team, and they became galvanized by their brush with death. Now, keep in mind, this is a Pluto and Scorpio team. Nick Foles is a true millennial. He's 29 years old, going through his Saturn return, by the way. In fact, Saturn just passed over his natal Saturn and passed over his natal Uranus. And I thought to myself, well, this guy is going to have a great game. And he did. And I predicted that the Eagles would win the game and that Nick Foles would be the MVP. And that's how it happened. That's how it unfolded. But getting back to his Aquarian nature, during that season, they had two guys calling plays. And the one guy that was calling the passing plays, Nick Foles, was not thrilled with the passing plays. So he took it onto himself to change the plays. Now, if you know anything about high school football or football in general, hierarchies are really integral and an essential part of the game, theoretically speaking. Again, we go back to Bill Belichick. He's from the Navy. It's all about hierarchy, chain of command. You do what you're told. And Belichick says, just do your job. That's his famous mantra. Just do your job. You do your job. Everybody does their job, and we have a great chance of winning. Makes sense. But for a high school player to call a different play, well, that's kind of a big deal because you're bucking the system. You're bucking the system and you're doing something that's against the grain. And this is what Foles was doing when he was a high school player. So we can see to some extent that he has an Aquarian streak running through him, that he's different in his own way. Now he became, or I don't know if he was at that time, he was a huge Christian. He is a huge Christian, and this plays a very significant role in the Super Bowl. Very, very significant. Now the other Aquarian is Doug Peterson, who happens to be Nick Foles' coach. And then Justin Timberlake is the third Aquarian in the mix. So there are three Aquarians. Of course, we know things come in threes. And I looked at this and I'm saying, there's just way too much Aquarius going on here. Tom Brady being a Leo in opposition to Nick Foles and Doug Peterson. And again, I talked about this over on Clyde Lewis and some of the other stuff I was doing last week, where we have the combination of the eagle and the lion, which creates the alchemical symbol of the griffin, and which is another symbol of the Christos, as above, so below, because the eagle is the lord of the air, the lion is the lord of the land or lord of the jungle, as above, so below. So there is a whole series of symbols that I thought were quite interesting. Another symbol that I didn't get into with the Super Bowl has to do with the number 52. Okay, the number 52. Now I'm going to read a little bit here, so hang in there. In the cards of destiny, the 52nd year apparently is a really, really big year. It's a big year. It's called the critical year. So I'm going to read this. This is from the website, The Cards of Life. It says, what is the critical year and why do so many people die around age 52? So here we go. If you do a quick search on the internet, you will immediately find some astounding results. As a student of cardology, this is, what's this woman's name? I'll figure out her name in a second. As a student of cardology for over 16 years, I've read about this age with great interest. But it wasn't until I went through that time frame around ages 51, 52, 53 myself that I fully appreciated what this critical year means in one's personal life. It is a time of massive change and an opportunity for a better life, one filled with true happiness. So in my situation, I moved from California to Texas at the age of 52. I left California. I know from previous research on the Mayan civilization in writing my novel, Flying Between Heaven and Earth, that this age has some significance in the indigenous cultures. Robert Lee Camp, author of Cards of Your Destiny and Love Cards, and I discussed this very topic on my talk show, Flying Higher, on BBS Radio in April 2007. What is the real significance of the age 52? Let's take a closer look and imagine that each of these two calendars, she's talking about the Mayan calendar and the Gregorian calendar. Let's take a closer look and imagine that each of these two calendars, I'm sorry, so this is the Tun, 360 days. This is what she's talking about, the turning of the Zolkin and the Tun. So the Tun is the 360-day calendar, and the Zolkin is the 260-day calendar. Let's take a closer look and imagine that each of these two calendars are like gears in a clock, turning each other. The Maya had more than one calendar. The Zolkin revolves and turns the Tun, the prophetic and divine calendar. In doing so imparts its meanings of the aspects and intentions of creation. At 52 revolutions of the Tun calendar, when the calendars match back up again, every possible aspect and intention and every possible aspect and intention of creation has been experienced. This is 51 3/4 years in our Gregorian calendar. You can learn more in the Egg Moon, Living in the Question by Von Goodwin, blah, 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 blah. At the age of 52, At the age of 52 tongue, every Mayan and Native North American person becomes an elder in their tribe, as they too have now experienced all aspects and intentions of creation. So important was the 52-ton turns to the Maya that they would extinguish all fires. They made sure that every single spark of life was put out, all deaths were struck off, and civilization started again. Maybe we could apply this concept of releasing old debts and sins and starting our lives fresh and anew. It seems obvious now that at age 52 we reach a place where we have lived much of our divine purpose and get to choose whether or not to stay on the planet. Everyone gets to ask themselves if they want to continue to live or leave this lifetime. I have noticed in my own family and friends, and even with celebrities, that opportunities disguised as health issues or accidents happen within a year or so of this age to help provide that very choice, live or leave. I had that happen to me at 51, where I felt like I was dying, and I had to change my life and my diet. In Cardology, expert Robert Lee Camp's newsletter, September 2005, he says, I noticed earlier that many people die either in their 52 age year or within a year or so of that age. This alone seems unusual since we can live longer, so much longer these days due to modern medicine. At 52, I'm as healthy as I can be, but I can see that there is some force within me questioning my existence here on Terra. It's like a voice asking myself, do I have a good reason to stay here any longer? As Lee points out, we have a chance to hear our inner voice asking to make a stand for life and decide if we deserve something much better. This is true, and I have gone through this dialogue myself, even after the age of 52. Some say yes, and others, like Superman actor Christopher Reeve, say no. Reeve turned his personal tragedy into a public crusade, and from his wheelchair became the nation's most recognizable spokesman for spinal cord research. At age 52, he chose to leave. Could it be that his personal mission for his lifetime was complete? His birth date ironically was September 25th, 1952, so we have the inverse of 25 and 52. His wife Dana died later in 2006, 11 days before her 45th birthday. Age 44 is called a pre-birth year, and age 45 is called the rebirth year. Interestingly, age 52 is the year when everyone enters their 13-year Saturn planetary period in this system. This is now the card system. It is not astrological. 44 is the big year in astrology with the Saturn opposition. Another interesting fun fact about age 52 is there are also 52 cards in a deck and 52 weeks in a year. A year is complete and ends after 52 weeks, as we've just experienced for 2014. This is 4 years old, this piece. The number 52 is a very spiritual number. 5 plus 2 equals 7. It plays out in very unique ways in our lives. While this critical year may sound difficult, it is still a Jupiter year, a very blessed year that can bring magical events into the inner workings of our lives. You may also notice that many things that you began around age 44 or 45 will now be finished or completed in some way by age 52. Look for the magic and you will find it. I did. So there's a whole list of people that died at age 51 and that died at age 52. Some of them are pretty well known. People like, let's see, Bernie Mac. Who else would you know here? John Peel Bishop, Bernie Mac. At 51, who else? Billy Carter at 51, Calamity Jane, 51. Stanley Milgram, the researcher was Milgram at Stanford? Yeah. Marcel Proust, 51. Then a whole host of people at 52. Yeah. Lolo Soetoro, also known as Lolo Soetoro Mangunharjo, died at 52, the Indonesian stepfather of Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. So here we have the 44 and the 52. Why am I talking about this? Because Super Bowl LII is Super Bowl 52. It's the 52nd year of the Super Bowl, which means something has turned and something has changed. Something has turned. That Super Bowl, yesterday's game, in a lot of ways felt like an ending. And I'm not sure where this is all going to go with the Super Bowl or what happens. I'm sure we'll have another Super Bowl next year, but something has changed. And there are a couple of things that are, I think, are worth noting and looking at as it relates to that change. Number one, the Patriots lost. That's a big deal. It's a really, really big deal because everybody thought the Patriots were going to win. It was going to be Super Bowl number 6 for Tom Brady, tying him with Michael Jordan, number 6. There's all this 6 imagery, including the LII with the Lombardi Trophy and the 3 6s, which are the 3 9s inverted. So there's a lot of 6 imagery and symbolism. Kind of a big deal. So this did not happen. The Patriots did not win. Of course, this was like the centennial Super Bowl. This was the revolutionary Super Bowl where we had the 2 teams that were playing a huge role, of course, from a geographical perspective for the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary, for all intents and purposes, started in Boston Harbor with the false flag, known as the Boston Tea Party, and then culminated in the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which took place in Philadelphia. So we have an alpha and omega moment here. And the omega moment takes place in Philadelphia. And the team that wins this Super Bowl is the Philadelphia Eagles. And even from the entertainment perspective, with Justin Timberlake, I thought was very unusual in a lot of ways, because this is Timberlake's second time at the Super Bowl. And I believe the last time was when the New England Patriots played I think it was the Carolina Panthers, if I'm not mistaken. And that's when we had the wardrobe malfunction. Yeah, it was the Panthers. And Janet Jackson and seeing her boobie on national television. And Timberlake had not been back since. And I watched the halftime show. And it was a very odd halftime show. Started off below the stadium, so he's in the underworld. If you want to get into some of the symbolism, here it is. He starts off below the stadium. He's in the underworld. He's in a club, and there's strobing. There's lasers going on. It's looking very contemporary. Let's put it that way. And as he ascends from the underworld beneath the stadium, he is tempted by 3 sirens as he's moving up the ramp. 3 sirens. He has 3 temptations. 3 moments of temptation, and he is able to interact with them in a fairly graphic way, and then move on, and he ascends to the stage. He ascends to the world stage, which takes place, of course, inside of the stadium in Minnesota. And then he performs the music, which is mostly pablum. And there's a lot of dancing. There's a lot of, JT gyrations. And by the way, he's not going to age well. You can just see. He's starting to put on some weight. He's not going to age well. I'm just making an observation here. And then he does the tribute to Prince, obviously because he's in Minneapolis. That's where Prince is from. And we have the Let's Go Crazy moment where he's doing a Prince tribute. Prince is projected onto the screen. We have this purple color, right? So here we have this purple energy, which is the combination of the red and the blue. And we talked about this with Clyde Lewis, the red moon and the blue moon combining to create the color purple. So here we have this manifestation of purple, the joining together of the color spectrum. And he does his set, and it's unremarkable. It's completely unremarkable. Other than the symbolism of him starting beneath the stadium and the underworld, and the denizens of the night and the club, and coming out to the light of day, even though it's not day, it is this Dionysic and the Apollonian combination of the two. He leaves the Dionysian world and he ascends into the Apollonian world of light. This is what he does. Other than that, in the Prince symbolism, not much remarkable takes place. And one of the things that is that really struck me about his performance is, where do we go from here in terms of Super Bowl halftime performances? Where do they go after this? Are they going to bring Lady Gaga back again? How many times can they roll Katy Perry out? Is Britney Spears due for a comeback as he taps his wrist? Beyonce will not perform at a Super Bowl. I don't believe. Not during the Trump administration. Clearly, Jay-Z won't perform at a Super Bowl. But you never know. You never know. He might. The next one is in Atlanta. I would expect Atlanta artists to be a part of this. Somebody like Lil Wayne, or whoever is popular in Atlanta. Some Atlanta hip hop. Ludacris. I think Ludacris is from Atlanta, isn't he? Maybe those guys will pop up. Lil Jon, Lil Wayne, Ludacris. So we might get a little bit of Atlanta flavor. Although, you never know. Maybe the next Super Bowl is country and western. Because, again, we're in the South. So, but it really struck me that, where do they go after this with the entertainment? Because if you look around, there are no rock stars anymore, by the way. There are pop stars and pop bands, and there are bands, but there are no rock stars anymore. There are no real rock bands. I mean, think about that for just a moment. Think about the Rolling Stones, or Aerosmith, or Springsteen, U2 to some extent. I mean, these are rock bands, and maybe they could trot U2 out again. Who knows? They're over. They're done. These are rock bands. These are iconic forces, and the people who were fronting those bands, either personally or through the collective effort of the band, are icons themselves, and we don't produce that anymore. They're not happening. They're just not happening. One of the things that came out yesterday was, one of the songs that connected the Eagles together was a hip hop tune by Meek Mill. Do you know who Meek Mill is? Well, Meek Mill is now in prison, and he's one of an ephemeral hip hop artist who's a comet streaking across the sky, and it explodes. So again, this whole JT thing was fascinating because it represents the end of something, and this is connected into that 52-year cycle. It was a very interesting Super Bowl to that extent. Very, very interesting, because the halftime show seemed tired and dilapidated and just played out. The Patriots feeling really like they're on the downside of this dynasty. And Tom Brady suffering his third loss against 5 wins, creating the number 8, as above, so below. The image of the griffin, right? So it's a very interesting time. And on the other side with the Eagles, again, you have Nick Foles and the entire team who are born again Christians. Or not born again, but just Christians. Who knows what their path to salvation, quote unquote, has been. But I was watching this, and I was watching the Eagles earlier in the season, and I was listening to Carson Wentz. And Carson Wentz is a Capricorn, and he was playing with this evangelical fervor. I mean, this guy was on fire. I played him a couple times in my fantasy football league. I played against him, and both times I played against him, whoever had Carson Wentz beat me, because he was so productive from a football perspective. So here he is putting up these gaudy stats, he's like a better version of Tim Tebow. That's who Carson Wentz is. He's also a more, how do I say this? I wouldn't say humble. Maybe I'll say humble. Self-effacing. Tim Tebow did that kneeling and stuff because Tim Tebow is a Leo. That's what he does. He's a performer. That's what he does. Carson Wentz is a Capricorn. He just gets down to business. And so I was watching him, and I was watching the Eagles play. I'm like, my God, this is kind of an interesting team, because they continue to keep getting better and better and better. And then, of course, Carson Wentz gets hurt in week 15, and Nick Foles enters the picture. And Nick Foles actually plays a Christ-like role in the Eagles' path to the Super Bowl because Nick Foles' career was nearly dead. He came into the league. He played 3 years for the Eagles. His second season with the Eagles, Nick Foles was lights out. He was a Pro Bowl quarterback. He had one of the best statistical seasons out of anybody in the history of the NFL. His cleats are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame for that season. I mean, think about that. And then all of a sudden they make it. He has a rough year the following year, gets hurt a few times. The league catches up with Chip Kelly's offense, and then they trade him to St. Louis, where St. Louis is where all quarterbacks went to die. Whether it was Sam Bradford or Nick Foles or Case Keenum or Jared Goff, all four of those players, by the way, have experienced higher degrees of success once they left the boneyard of St. Louis where Jeff Fisher coached. Jeff Fisher was not the Fisher King. Let's be clear about that. So Nick Foles gets released. He asks for his release from the St. Louis Rams, now the Los Angeles Rams. And he was about to retire from pro football. The game had lost meaning. And again, this is a guy of faith. He was, really asking what he should do. And all of a sudden, Andy Reid, who coaches the Kansas City Chiefs, comes in and says, hey, look, we want you. We need a backup quarterback for Alex Smith. So he signs Nick Foles. Foles plays there for 2 years. Doesn't play a whole lot. Becomes a free agent and then is signed by the Eagles again. So it's important to just chart his path because it's the alpha and the omega. It's the alpha and the omega because he starts off with the Eagles, has great success, and then he winds up leaving town and going out west, and where his career dies. And like the prodigal son, he returns, is resurrected, and winds up becoming the most valuable player of the Super Bowl. It's a fascinating story, really fascinating story. And then what you see with what I saw with almost everybody on the Philadelphia Eagles was a team that was bonded and knitted together by their faith. And again, you don't have to be a Christian to, at the very least, understand this principle that's at work here. Because it's clearly not just symbolic. It's a team that sort of united around one purpose. And this could, throw us down the path of dominionism and the kind of, Handmaid's Tale sort of ideology that is kind of inherent in all of this. But it also, to me, and again, I'm not a born again Christian, but I can clearly appreciate some of these things from an energetic perspective, and even because it's radical. This is radical. To be a Christian in modern day America is considered to be something that's not very popular, to be quite honest with you, which in this instance aligns with being an Aquarian. It's doing the contrarian piece, contrary to culture. And I'm not saying that that's why Nick Foles has become a Christian, but it's just an interesting sort of notice. But there's something that's ended here with this Super Bowl. Something has shifted. And I want you to just sit with that for a moment. Just sit with the energy. And sit with what I'm saying. Because again, we're in this 52-year cycle. This is the 52nd Super Bowl. Now, what happens after this is going to be fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So let's just tick it off one at a time. We have I believe the death of the Patriots dynasty. I think they're over. They're done. Josh McDaniels, the offensive coordinator, is going to coach Indianapolis Colts. Matt Patricia, who's a defensive coordinator, is going to coach the Detroit Lions. Okay, Lion and Eagle. There we go. And so Tom Brady is still there. But I'm not sure Tom Brady is going. I think Tom Brady's going to play one more season. I think he's going to play one more season. And he's going to try and go out on top next year because he doesn't know anything else, and he's an uber competitor, and he does not want to leave the game of pro football without being going out on top of winner. We got a comment here in the comments. I wonder if Steve's chiming in. 52 is the age of the Chiron return. Sometimes. 50 actually is closer. The thing with the Chiron, you see Chiron will be, and thanks for chiming in, Lynn. Chiron has an irregular orbit. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 9, but I would say between. So when I look at Chiron in a person's chart, I look to the degree of Chiron because that is generally considered the chirotic crisis in the chart. And I'll look at that degree. So let's say the degree is 15 Aquarius. I'll look at 14, 15, and 16. So when I'm looking at a chart, I'll ask a person what happened to you between the age of 14 and 16. Because that gives us that kind of 2-year zone. So it's that 2-year kind of spread. My Chiron return happened when I was 50, pretty much on the dot. But yeah, there's some latitude there. Chiron does play a role. We have Chiron coming into Aries, which is another piece that we could talk about because that's the wounded warrior. And I believe it's going to have an impact on pro football. And on Friday, I did a little YouTube video that's going to be up soon with Heather Eland. And I talked about how by the time Chiron moves into its next sign, 9 years from now, in Taurus, that the NFL will look very different. It will be a kind of maybe even a different sport, or the league itself may look very different. So interesting stuff. Anyway, we're in a different place now. If we look at the Super Bowl for this cultural event, these ciphers that give us a sense as to where things are going, in the 52nd year of the Super Bowl, in the critical year, with this passing of the torch, in some ways, from the Patriots to the Eagles, from the Alpha to the Omega, which again was the revolution that starts theoretically with a false flag in Boston Harbor to the culmination, which is the Declaration of Independence. We're at those two teams represent the end of a cycle, the beginning and the end. So I believe we're in new territory. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this year unfolds. And remember, this year is a 20-year. It is a 20-year. 2018 is a 20-year, which is the year of the Aeon in the major arcana. It is a year of reckoning. It is a year of endings and new beginnings. Theoretically, the Aeon is the dawn of a new age. And the new age is the 21st card, or the universe card. So a fascinating Super Bowl on so many levels. So many levels. Even to the point where we were not throttled by the heavy and over-the-top halftime symbolic ritual theater. You know, this is also very interesting, too, from the perspective of the generational astrology. Because the generation now that's going to start to move into popular culture is not the millennials. The millennials have already begun to integrate. Again, the oldest millennials are, around 33 now, 34, about 34 years old. We go back to like 1984, 85 is when the millennials really begin. And that's when Pluto goes into Scorpio, by the way. So now we're going to be talking about the post-millennial generation coming up. And that is Generation Z, and that is the Pluto and Sag kids. And again, when we look at Sagittarius, one of the things we get into is this talk about religion and God and faith and all these very Sagittarian kinds of concepts. If you go back in time and look at what happened during the late 60s, 69, 70, 71, that's when Neptune went into Sagittarius. If you look at the cinema during that time, a lot of it is very religiously oriented. You had movies like Brother Sun, Sister Moon, you had Godspell, Jesus Christ Superstar. Oh, and by the way, guess what's happening? Jesus Christ Superstar is going to be performed live on Easter with so yeah, there you go. There's just another little blip on the social, cultural, celestial, cosmic radar. We're going to be perhaps moving more into that kind of Sagittarian influence. And of course, we're going to have Jupiter coming into Sagittarius in late November of this year. Interesting stuff, really interesting. And that has nothing to do with all the other things that are going on in the world, because there's plenty of action out there. A Russian fighter was shot down yesterday over Syria, and there's some chatter that the United States provided the technology and equipment to shoot down that fighter. The Syrian rebels shot down this Russian fighter. There's a lot going on. We'll get into more of that tomorrow. We'll tackle some of the headlines tomorrow when we jump back into 15 Minutes of Flame. But for today, I'm out of here. I'm out of here. So thanks for tuning in and listening and kind of exploring and going down the post Super Bowl rabbit hole. Super Bowl LII or 52, and we're at 52 minutes in our broadcast today. Maybe I'll end it right at 52:52, which I can do in about 8 seconds. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart